Some stories don't just haunt you, they consume you. This is one of them. A case so shocking, so twisted, that it changed an entire town forever. John Bunting didn't look the part. Your average mate from Australia's roughest streets. But behind that smile burned a hatred so deep, it turned him into the country's worst serial killer. For 7 years, he and his crew tortured and butchered 11 people, some even eaten. In May 1999, cops kicked open a bank vault in Snowtown, a tiny south town of just 500 souls, named after the Snow family, a prominent clan of people who lived in the area in the late 19th century. There is no snow in Snowtown. It is a warm, dry, forgotten. Inside, 6 barrels oozing with melted flesh, arms twisted, skulls staring through the sludge. Step into Snowtown, where evil hid across from the pub, and no one suspected a thing. This is crimes that shook the world. Snowtown's about to pull you in. Brace yourself. Every monster has a beginning. John Justin Bunting started on September 4th, 1966, growing up in the inner-city suburb of Inala in Queensland, Australia, a rough patch where hope wore thin, lived in an environment of high crime and unemployment rates. The working class was largely made up of public housing and was home to many immigrant families. His parents, Tom and Jan, worked hard to keep their only kid fed, clothed, maybe even safe. But something was off from the start. At 8, a throat infection stole his sense of smell. He'd never taste the air again. Didn't stop him, though. He'd crouch in the backyard, digging holes, deep ones, hours lost in the dirt, while neighbors joked he'd tunnel to China. He'd pull out his camera too, snapping shots of birds stiff with death, their feathers catching the light. When Bunting was around 8 years old while at a playdate, Bunting and his friend were physically and sexually assaulted by the friend's older brother, according to Bunting. The attack lasted some time and only ended when the boy's father came home. Bunting didn't tell his parents about the attack at the time, and the older brother in question died in a motorcycle accident soon after. Because of that, it's hard to confirm with certainty that the story is true. As a teenager, the darkness took root. As he grew up, Bunting's interests and hobbies shifted, and he developed a fondness for weapons. He seemed fixated on all manners of weaponry. Eventually, his interest led him to World War I, books he picked up from the library. This later led him to German history, Nazism, and white supremacy. Somehow, Bunting got his hands on a copy of Mein Kampf, My Struggle, by Adolf Hitler, and even painted a swastika on his car, though his horrified mother painted over it. It was around this time, as he slowly devoured racist literature, that Bunting's dislike of pedophilia. Bunting seemed unable to distinguish these predators from gay men. Either no one told Bunting that, or he had no interest in believing it, because the two concepts were inextricably linked in his mind. His beliefs progressed into adulthood with exceptionally violent consequences. At 18, he landed a job in a crematorium up in Queensland. Loved it too much. He'd peel back corpses, trace their bones with his fingers, watch them burn. His co-workers sensed his unsettling fascination and fired him. By 1989, Bunting had settled in Adelaide's northern suburbs, an area filled with broken families, meth houses, and people no one would miss. Working at the South Australia Meat Corps, a slaughterhouse in Adelaide, where pigs swung from hooks and blood soaked the floors. The work didn't faze him. He can't smell the rot, but he felt the power. That's when it brewed, this sick need to fix the world his way. In January 1989, when John was 22, he signed up for a metalworking course offered at the abattoir. It was there that he met 18-year-old Veronica Tripp, who had hearing and vision problems and intellectual disability and was reported to not be able to read very well. She was someone that John could easily control, which is how he liked it. They regularly went to the movies together, but Veronica claims that Bunting always picked the movies and they were invariably violent. When Veronica turned 19, she moved out of her parents' place and into a house with Bunting and his roommates. A few months later, in September 1989, Veronica Tripp and John Bunting got married at a registry office, but continued living in the same house with the roommates. Eventually, in December 1991, John and Veronica moved out and got a place of their own in the sketchy suburb of Salisbury North. Soon after they arrived, they met a couple who lived not too far away. Barry Lane, previously known as Vanessa Lane, a transvestite with a record for preying on the vulnerable, and Robert Joe Wagner, 6'4", silent, a wall of muscle carrying a lifetime of scars, and theirs was a complicated relationship. Robert Joe Wagner was born on the 28th of November 1971. His father abandoned him and his older sister when he was only 6 months old. As a child, Robert was regularly beaten by his mom's new boyfriend. And when Robert was 7, he was sexually abused by the teenage son of one of his mother's friends. Robert didn't talk about what happened. In fact, he barely spoke at all for several months, and then still, at the shockingly young age of 7, Robert attempted to end his life by taking an overdose of his mother's sleeping pills. After that, Robert was never quite the same. He struggled at school and was functionally illiterate, even being held back a year in primary school. In 1984, at the age of 13, Robert stopped turning up to school altogether and ran right around the neighborhood, disappearing for days at a time, with his mother frequently reporting him missing to the police. In mid-1985, Robert Wagner, still just 13 years old, met 30-year-old Barry Lane. Barry Lane, previously known as Vanessa Lane, was a male-to-female transgender born in 1955 under the name Barry Wayne Lane. Barry's father was a violent alcoholic, and Barry's mother, Sylvia, was extremely neglectful, almost causing her child to die of malnutrition. Barry briefly spent time in foster care before Barry's grandmother won guardianship, raising Barry in poverty in the mining town. At the age of 9, Barry began dressing up in a hot pink skirt and fishnet stockings, much to his grandmother's confusion. At age 11, Barry came out to friends. By 15, Barry was walking the streets of Port Par, waving at men in their cars who slowed down, honked, and yelled. Barry's grandmother did not approve of Barry's behavior, and Barry's mother, Sylvia, began claiming that Barry, aka Vanessa Lane, wasn't her child, but that they'd somehow gotten her mixed up in the maternity ward. At 17, Barry Lane moved to Adelaide. To pay the bills, Barry Lane worked as a gardener for 2 weeks before claiming permanently injured her back in order to collect disability funds. In late 1980, when Barry Lane was 25, was arrested for sexual assault of 2 boys under the age of 12. Barry was sentenced to just 4 months' imprisonment. Judge explained that the shortness of the sentence was in light of Lane's gender dysphoria. After being released, Barry Lane moved to Salisbury North in Adelaide, where Lane was witnessed on multiple occasions approaching underage boys. It wasn't long before Lane gained a reputation, with a house frequently being vandalized. 5 years later, in 1985, Lane, now 30 years old, met 13-year-old Robert Wagner and formed a sexual relationship. When Wagner's mother, Carol, found out, she forbade her son from seeing Lane. Robert ignored this demand, so Carol went over to Lane's house and confronted the both of them. Robert said he wanted to stay with Barry, who was holding Robert's arm and stroking his chest. Carol went home and called the police. Robert was brought home, but Lane wasn't immediately charged. In January 1986, 2 months after Robert had turned 14, he and Barry ran away together. They disappeared without a trace. Robert's mother didn't hear a word from her son for nearly 4 years. Barry Lane and Robert Wagner returned to Salisbury North in late 1989, shortly after Robert had turned 18 years old. With the age of consent in South Australia being 17, the police could no longer do anything about the relationship, and Wagner vowed that he'd deny any allegations of being groomed or kidnapped. Police did not pursue the matter further. The now 34-year-old Barry permitted Robert to resume contact with his mother. Lane and Wagner rented a house together across the street from an elementary school. Neither of them worked. By this point, Wagner had also figured out how to fake a physical illness to collect disability payments. In 1989, Wagner joined a group called National Action Australia, a white nationalist organization founded in the early 1980s, known for promoting racist, anti-immigration, and neo-Nazi ideologies. Wagner wanted to have a swastika tattooed on his forehead, but no tattoo artist would do it. Wagner was thrown out of National Action after only a year for being, quote, too radical for the group. When John Bunting and Veronica moved to Waterloo Corner Road on the 14th of December 1991, they met their next-door neighbor, Robert Skews, a welfare recipient in his mid-50s who suffered brain damage at birth and had spent a good portion of his life homeless. It was Robert Skews who that introduced John to Barry Lane and Robert Wagner. Wagner helped John Bunting move his stuff into the house. John's initial instinct was to despise Lane and Wagner. It was clear that Lane was an unrepentant pedophile. However, as they talked, Bunting realized that Wagner not only shared his affinity for Nazism, but also been sexually abused as a child. As such, Bunting quickly felt that he and Wagner were kindred spirits. Meanwhile, Bunting tolerated Lane, especially once it became clear that Lane could provide inside information on Adelaide's bevy of other child predators. Wagner despised himself for associating with Lane, his shame festering relentlessly. Bunting saw that pain and used it. Soon, perhaps even from their first meeting, Bunting assigned himself a mission on behalf of his new friend. Convinced that Wagner wasn't truly gay, he believed Lane had brainwashed him through grooming. Determined to rescue Wagner from his predatory partner, Bunting took him under his wing. By 1995, the two were inseparable, digging holes under moonlight, plotting something dark. Shortly after moving in, John Bunting befriended another neighbor, 33-year-old Mark Ray Hayden, whom he met at a metalworking course in 1992. Hayden was a wiry man with a weak chin, the type who'd follow a shadow if it barked loud enough. Born Mark Ray Lawrence on the 4th of December 1958, he was raised primarily by his father, Edward Lawrence. His mother, who suffered from schizophrenia, was frequently institutionalized. Mark's father worked at the General Motors Holden factory, and in 1976, when Mark turned 18, his father secured him a job there spray painting cars. Mark lasted only 2 years before being fired for theft, after which he refused to work again and went on welfare. He managed to scam a carer's pension by insisting he looked after his aging father. Mark Hayden, barely educated and described by acquaintances as slow-speaking, spent his days drinking and tinkering with cars. He never held steady employment, and at some point he changed his name to Mark Hayden. Suzanne Allen was another resident in the neighborhood. Susan Phyllis Martin was born in the town of Mildura, in the state of Victoria, on June 26, 1949. When she was 14, she left home to work at a sheep station in New South Wales. 20 years later, she had had 2 failed marriages and 4 children. The kids were all in the custody of her ex-husbands and had very few contact with her, maybe a visit every year or two, or a card at Christmas. By the time she was 34, she changed her first name to Suzanne and retained her second ex-husband's surname, Allen. In 1983, she moved to Adelaide, rented a house in Salisbury North, and went on welfare. When Suzanne Allen was in her early 30s, doctors diagnosed her with a series of maladies: obesity, asthma, heart disease, high blood pressure, carpal tunnel syndrome, and an intellectual disability. While living in Salisbury North, Suzanne was an avid attendee of nightclubs where she tried to find a new man. The 1980s were filled with Suzanne entering one toxic relationship after another. In 1989, when Suzanne was 40 years old, she met 20-year-old Ray Davies. Ray Davies was born in June 1969 as James Leslie Davies. Both of his parents had intellectual disabilities, and they passed that on to their son. He was raised by an aunt as a child. By the time Davies was 20, having arbitrarily changed his name to Ray, he had a criminal record for theft and assault. In 1989, Ray Davies moved to Adelaide. Davies befriended Lane and Robert Wagner. They offered to help Davies find a permanent place for his caravan home in Salisbury North. Suzanne Allen ultimately was their huckleberry, cheerfully agreeing to let Davies park his caravan in her backyard. Suzanne, of course, had an ulterior motive. She was lonely. She persuaded Davies into a relationship. He moved into Suzanne's house, with the caravan still kept in the backyard. The relationship between Ray Davies and Suzanne Allen lasted for 4 years, with Davies committing several acts of domestic violence against Allen. In 1993, Suzanne Allen and Ray Davies became engaged, but their relationship imploded when a neighbor reported Davies for lurking in bushes and masturbating as young girls walked by. Suzanne broke off the engagement. However, driven by loneliness and poor judgment, she allowed Davies to remain in her life, even letting him live in the caravan behind her house. As disgusting as Ray Davies' history appears, his mental impairments were likely far more severe than doctors or social workers recognized. He should have been institutionalized. A deeply disturbed individual, Davies received grossly inadequate treatment and was left to roam unchecked, free to spiral into predatory behavior. Meanwhile, in 1995, Suzanne Allen became obsessed with John Bunting. Her feelings were completely one-sided. Bunting had no interest in the 46-year-old woman who was overweight and had learning difficulties. Still, Bunting often visited her house, though he usually brought Robert Wagner along. John Bunting's wife, Veronica, discovered his affairs but stayed with him and kept quiet. Their marriage had mostly fallen apart, and John began sleeping with other women, including Suzanne. They began a casual sexual relationship in which John developed a high level of control over her. John, still married to Veronica and entangled with Suzanne, soon crossed paths with Elizabeth Harvey, a recently divorced woman who became yet another perfect target for his manipulation. Elizabeth Harvey, born Christine Ann Eude in September 1953, endured a traumatic childhood. Her mother abandoned the family to flee with an abusive alcoholic, subjecting Christine and her siblings to years of physical and sexual abuse. The nightmare only ended when the man died abruptly of a heart attack. Though freed from the abuse, Christine was left with irreversible psychological scars, chronic depression, and hypersexuality. At just 15 years old, she attempted suicide, a stark reflection of her unaddressed trauma. In 1970, at age 17, Christine began a 6-year affair with an older, married man. When she became pregnant at age 23, he abruptly ended the relationship, refusing to acknowledge the child. When she asked how to explain the pregnancy to her mother, he coldly replied, "Look for 3 wise men and the Star of Bethlehem." Her first son, Troy Eude, was born on August 30th, 1976. 3 years later, in early 1979, Christine answered a newspaper ad for a housemaid and traveled to Broken Hill, New South Wales, to meet a potential employer, Spiridon Vlasakis, a 43-year-old owner of a failing Greek restaurant. He picked her up from the airport and took her on a dinner date. 3 months later, instead of working as his housemaid, she became his wife. The couple relocated to Adelaide after the restaurant collapsed, relying on welfare and moving into government housing. Spiridon refused to work, and the marriage grew increasingly abusive. It was during this period of turmoil that Christine became pregnant with James, who arrived on December 24, 1979. In 1981, Christine briefly moved into a separate government-provided home but remained married, with the children bouncing between them. Spiridon sexually abused both his stepson Troy Eude and his biological son James. After 18 months, Christine moved back in with Spiridon, who immediately started abusing her and the sons. Then, at 3 a.m. on June 13, 1986, Spiridon Vlasakis dropped dead of a heart attack. James, 6 years old, watched him die. Within 2 months of Spiridon's death, Christine, now legally renamed Elizabeth Harvey to shake off the name Christine Vlasakis, met Marcus Johnson, a middle-aged divorcee working at a car factory. Marcus was decent to Elizabeth, aka Christine. The two entered a common-law relationship that lasted several years. During this time, Elizabeth's eldest son, Troy Eude, reached adolescence and began sexually abusing his younger half-brother, James Vlasakis. Neither Elizabeth nor Marcus were aware of the abuse. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Harvey fell into multiple depressive episodes due to Marcus pressuring her into 2 abortions. Marcus Johnson didn't want any more children. He already had 3 kids from his previous marriage that ended in 1980, one of whom, David Johnson, had come to live with him, Elizabeth and her sons. But Elizabeth resented having to get abortions. Their relationship became fraught with arguments and separations. In a last-ditch effort to salvage things, Marcus and Elizabeth finally married in 1992, Elizabeth already thinking of getting a divorce before the marriage license was even signed, and decided to keep her adopted surname Harvey. By then, she had become dependent on Valium, gambling, and compulsive shopping to numb her depression. Marcus and Elizabeth divorced after 10 months of marriage. Elizabeth Harvey was left to raise her sons on her own. Impoverished, living in Salisbury North, strung out on benzodiazepines while battling mental illness. In late 1993, Elizabeth discovered a lump in one of her breasts and underwent testing for breast cancer. A few months later, her mother died of throat cancer, triggering a nervous breakdown that landed Elizabeth in a psychiatric ward. Her neighbor, Jeffrey Payne, offered to care for her sons during her hospitalization. Unbeknownst to Elizabeth, Payne was a pedophile who targeted 13-year-old James, threatening to harm his brothers and kill Elizabeth if he resisted. After months in the ward, Elizabeth Harvey was released. Also, it turned out that the tumor in her breast was benign. She was still in poor shape mentally and was oblivious to what was going on between Payne and her sons, but hell came from the most unlikely quarter. Convicted child predator Barry Lane was an acquaintance of Jeffrey Payne, and Payne had bragged to Lane about molesting James Vlasikis, and with the contorted logic of a pedophile, Lane became jealous of that fact and resolved to tell James's mother what was going on. On March 3, 1994, Barry Lane and Robert Wagner arrived at Elizabeth Harvey's house and informed her that Jeffrey Payne was abusing her son. Elizabeth immediately called the police, leading to Payne's arrest and confession. However, he was soon released on bail and returned to his home across the street. While awaiting trial, Payne would sit on his front porch, hurling obscene taunts at Elizabeth's sons and referring to them as "my boys." When Barry Lane learned of Payne's ongoing harassment, he alerted John Bunting, a self-appointed local vigilante targeting pedophiles. Within the hour, Bunting came riding down the street on a motorbike armed with a .38 revolver. After introducing himself to Elizabeth Harvey, Bunting took Robert Wagner across the street and confronted Payne. Bunting issued graphic threats while Wagner stood silently behind him, nodding in agreement. The intimidation worked. Payne stopped harassing the children. Yet Bunting, Wagner, Mark Hayden, and Lane spent the following days huddled in Elizabeth's kitchen, plotting Payne's murder to make an example of him. Their preferred plan was to knock him unconscious, stage a motorcycle accident, and push him off a cliff. Elizabeth's ex-husband, Marcus Johnson, occasionally overheard these discussions. He later remarked, "Lane was present in a lot of these conversations, and I couldn't work out where she fitted in at any time, being on both sides of the fence as it were." Despite their scheming, Payne was never harmed. Bunting likely realized that Payne's sudden death, or disappearance, would draw police scrutiny toward Elizabeth and her allies. Instead, Payne stood trial, was convicted, and received a 4-year prison sentence. Bunting, likely convinced Elizabeth was incapable of caring for her sons alone, took it upon himself to act as their protector and perhaps pursue darker intentions. By late 1994, he and Elizabeth were entangled in a romantic relationship. His marriage to Veronica had all but collapsed, and he increasingly devoted his time to his new girlfriend and her children. After a year of dating, John Bunting invited Elizabeth Harvey and her sons to move into his home, which he still shared with his wife, Veronica Tripp. Though aware of the affair, Veronica felt powerless to intervene. She avoided social events where Elizabeth might appear, yet now faced living under the same roof. John Bunting targeted his wife, Veronica Tripp, precisely because her developmental disability made her easier to control. Veronica isolated and manipulated, internalizing blame for the collapse of their marriage. Believed her perceived inadequacy in satisfying John had driven him away. Bunting arrogantly assumed Veronica would eventually accept the arrangement, but she didn't. Over the following year, she began staying with relatives for increasingly long stretches, until she left for good. Though the couple never formally divorced, John began introducing Elizabeth as his wife, cementing his control over her fractured family. Then there was James Spiridon Vlasikis. James Vlasikis just wanted someone to protect him, but instead of finding safety, he was hurt over and over by people he should have been able to trust. His father abused him, and even his older half-brother Troy allegedly did the same, though no one knows exactly when or for how long. The abuse broke James. By his early teens, he'd started showering obsessively, scrubbing his skin until it bled. Though never formally diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, his behavior after the abuse strongly suggested he suffered from it nonetheless. He began self-medicating with drugs and alcohol, and before long, he was a heavy user of both. By the time John Bunting entered his life, James had been hurt by so many men that he was desperate for someone, anyone, to make him feel safe. It's hardly surprising, then, that James idolized Bunting, a man whose outspoken, violent hatred of pedophiles and gay men made him seem like a twisted champion to the impressionable teen. Bunting noticed how easily James could be influenced and stepped into the role of a father figure, pulling him into his orbit, enlisting him in his grim gang. On the surface, Bunting played the caring mentor. He convinced James to stay in school, took him on bike rides, and even to the movies. But beneath this veneer of paternal care lay something far darker. Bunting forced James to watch as he killed and skinned neighborhood pets. In one horrifying moment, he pressured James to shoot a dog. When James froze, Bunting grabbed the gun and did it himself. John Bunting picked victims randomly, often for made-up reasons. Some were killed because he thought they were pedophiles, claims based on just rumors or weak proof. Others died simply because Bunting hated fat people, drug users, or gay men. Most victims were friends or acquaintances of at least one member of Bunting's group. Some were even family members who shared homes with the killers. A few were tricked into joining the group briefly, only to become targets themselves. Bunting showed no empathy or remorse, acting like a true psychopath who got a sick thrill from controlling others. He forced victims to address him as God, Master, Chief Inspector, or Lord Sir. In a spare room of his house, he created a rock spider wall, a web-like chart made of paper notes and wool, linking names of individuals he alone accused of being pedophiles or gay. Bunting would pluck a name from the wall and threaten them. The killers often stole victims' social security and bank details to impersonate them post-mortem and collect their pensions. While they pocketed over $97,000, money wasn't the real goal. It was about power and cruelty. Behind Bunting's web of cruelty lay ordinary lives, people swallowed by a nightmare not of their making. Let us now step into their stories, not as faceless victims, but as those whose humanity was stolen by a predator's wrath. In August 1992, the first life was claimed. Clinton Douglas Trezise, a soft-spoken 18-year-old from Adelaide, vanished without a trace, marking the grim start of Australia's Snowtown murders, later infamous as the Bodies in Barrels case. Born on December 5, 1973, Clinton's childhood was fractured. His parents divorced when he was 3, leaving him and his younger brother to drift through foster care. By 18, he lived alone in a modest apartment, openly gay but intensely private, a quiet soul who avoided trouble and kept his circles small. Among his acquaintances were Barry Lane and Robert Wagner, a connection that would unknowingly seal his fate. On August 31, 1992, Clinton accepted an invitation to John Bunting's home on Waterloo Corner Road in Salisbury North. He arrived expecting a casual evening, unaware Lane and Wagner were already there. What followed was a horror. Bunting, fueled by his hatred of gay men, suddenly accused Clinton of being a pedophile, a baseless lie with no basis in reality. When Clinton tried to brush off the accusation and leave, Bunting grabbed a shovel and struck him twice. The first blow shattered his skull, the second crushed his face. The trio wrapped his body in carpet, crammed it into Barry's pickup truck, and drove 50 kilometers to Lower Light, a desolate stretch of farmland. There they buried him in a shallow grave. For 2 years, Clinton's remains lay forgotten. His family, assuming he'd vanished like so many troubled youths from broken homes, never reported him missing. Meanwhile, farmers Jack and Ron Finch stumbled upon his skeleton on August 16, 1994, while spraying weeds on their property. A skull stared up from the dirt. There were no clothes, no ID, just bleached bones and dyed hair. On October 26, 1995, over 3 years after Clinton's murder, his mother Marilyn finally filed a missing person report. Police sent a photo of Clinton to the South Australian Forensic Science Centre, requesting a comparison to the unidentified skull found at Lower Light in 1994. Tragically, the forensic technicians made a catastrophic error. They concluded Clinton's bone structure did not match the skull. This mistake halted the investigation into Trezise's murder entirely. Had the team connected the dots, Bunting's gang might have been stopped. Instead, Clinton's skeleton remained unidentified for another 4 years, an oversight with devastating consequences. By the time the truth emerged, Bunting's killing spree had escalated, claiming lives that might otherwise have been spared.